This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. My guest today, Burt Kearns, co-wrote the book The Show Won't Go On with Jeff Abraham, who is an entertainment publicist and comedy historian. Vanity Fair called the two of them show business and pop culture savants. Burt is a television and film producer, director, writer, journalist, and author of the controversial tabloid television memoir, Tabloid Baby. His credits include Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, Kardashian, the man who saved O.J. Simpson, and The Seventh Python, which is about Neil Innes. With two-time Academy Award winner Albert S. Ruddy, he co-wrote and produced the Burt Reynolds movie Cloud 9. So for those reasons and many more, I'm very happy to welcome Burt Kearns to StoryBeat today. Burt, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. So, all right, let's go back to a little bit of your beginning. When and where did you first decide in your life that maybe entertainment was where you wanted to be and that maybe writing is how you wanted to live through that?
Well, writing was always my thing from the time I was a kid. I was the writer in school. It was my dream from the time I was a kid to, write that great American novel, write the book. I went to college, and during college I wrote for local newspapers, wrote wherever I could, wrote essays, etc. And then my first job was at a small-town newspaper in Connecticut,
right.
The Ridgefield Press. The Ridgefield Press was part of a newspaper chain up in Connecticut and in upstate New York. And I was a newspaper reporter there for about a year and a half, and then became an editor of one of the papers in Wilton, Connecticut. And that was really my graduate school of just writing every day, writing feature stories, going to planning and zoning meetings, covering car accidents, covering small town.
And that was journalism, not really so much entertainment, right?
Right, that was journalism. I was a journalist. From there, my dream was to move to New York City. It was about 60 miles outside of New York, where I grew up. I was born in New York City, grew up in Connecticut. My dream was to eventually move to New York. Well, what happened was on December 7th, 1980, John Lennon was killed. And when John Lennon was killed, I said, "That's it. I'm out of here. I'm moving to New York." I went down to the Dakota that weekend for all the funeral, not festivities, but funeral services and things that were going on, memorials that were going on outside for John Lennon.
Right.
And then I moved to New York. My entree into New York was a promise to get a job at the Village Voice, the independent newspaper in New York City. I was going to be a copy editor as a way in. I'm the worst copy editor in the world. I'm the worst proofreader there is. I always miss those little words. I didn't get a job at the Village Voice, but somehow serendipitously, through a college acquaintance, through a friend, I wound up getting a job on the assignment desk of the 10 o'clock news.
Oh, yeah?
Channel 5 News in New York. That's the independent, scrappy news station there.
As a copywriter, or what were you doing?
I got a job on the assignment desk, and that was sitting there with the assignment editor, listening to police radios, and sending crews and reporters out on stories.
I see.
Now, one of the things that really came in handy was my experience of 3 years of working in local newspapers. I knew how to make a call. I knew how to set up a story. I knew what a story was. Within a couple of months, I was promoted to assignment editor. Then I became a writer for the 10 o'clock news. Then I became producer of the 10 o'clock weekend news.
Mm-hmm.
Basically because of the preparation that I had before I came to New York. I didn't just show up and say, give me a job. I had experience in journalism.
Of course.
And then from there, I went on from Channel 5 News I moonlighted over at CBS Network News. I worked as a writer on a show called Night Watch. That was later Charlie Rose took over Night Watch. That was like a middle of the night show. I think it went on from 2 o'clock in the morning till 6 in the morning.
Right.
So I would leave work at the 10 o'clock news at 11 o'clock, go across town, and then write for Night Watch all night, and then go back to work the next morning.
So you weren't sleeping at that point?
I didn't. I was young. I didn't really have to sleep too much.
Right.
It was all right.
Did you enjoy? Well, I guess "enjoy" is the wrong word. Was it? I assume that it was something that was really inspiring to you. You probably learned a lot of stories doing that.
Well, I'll tell you, working in New York City at night, when you're a news person, it's a whole nother experience. It's romantic, it's journalism, it's hard scrabble. It's great, especially working for a team like the 10 o'clock news. The 10 o'clock news was a newsroom of journalistic giants and not stars. From the 10 o'clock news, I wound up going over to WNBC News at 30 Rockefeller Center.
Right.
As first a news writer and then a producer of the shows there.
Wow.
And that was more, much more commercial, and you're working with, television stars. I was there, I was producing the 10 o'clock news on the weekend when we got a new weatherman named Al Roker who showed up from Cleveland.
Right.
And, worked with Al in those days and worked with people who went on, as I did, into different directions. But working in New York News was quite an experience. I remember my first Christmas in New York. I was working on the assignment desk, working on Christmas morning, and I had to go to Central Park. They sent me up there because it was a skeleton crew on Christmas, and they sent me up to the north side of Central Park to the lake there because there was a body in the lake.
Ugh.
And I had to be there when they fished out the body.
You've been following dead people all your life.
Yeah. Now the reason this was like a little macabre, black humor sort of rule that was in news at the time, and that was if ever there was a murder in Harlem or in that area, you had to check on it because there was always the possibility that it could be a Kennedy.
Oh.
Because at that time, David Kennedy, who later died of a drug overdose down in Palm Beach, I believe, he was arrested for drugs in a Harlem tenement at that point.
Really?
Right around then. So it was always like, you got to check. Could be a Kennedy. That Christmas morning, it wasn't a Kennedy. It was a poor vagrant who slipped into the water.
I guess the news business has long been, if it bleeds, it leads. So you got to go after those stories, right?
Most definitely on the local news, and that hasn't changed.
No.
For all these years, yeah.
No, it certainly hasn't. That's the sort of, I don't want to use the word formula, but it's a kind of a formula. If it's nasty, gnarly, people could get hurt, they'll go after that first.
Most definitely. Yeah.
So from there, how did you wind up in Hollywood?
All right, here we go. So I went over to, I was at NBC News for about 5 years. While I was there, Rupert Murdoch took over Metro Media News. And where I used to work at the 10 o'clock news now became a very different kind of 10 o'clock news run by Rupert Murdoch's Australians.
Right.
And while they were there, they started a show called A Current Affair.
Yes.
Which was really the first tabloid television news magazine show. So a lot of the people that I worked with back in the early 80s at Channel 5 were now working for the Australians. And they said, man, you've got to come over here. You're going to love these guys. I mean, they're brilliant. They're hilarious. There's a lot of, they do things that no one would ever think of doing in news. So I went over, and I was basically kidnapped by the Australians in the end of 1988. There was a guy named Peter Brennan, one of the most brilliant minds in television. Peter was the architect and the executive producer of A Current Affair. And the new guy that had taken over above Peter had said, look, we just lost our two producers of the show. Peter runs the show. He's brilliant, but the problem is that he doesn't like to work in the office. He does all the work from the bar across the street.
Oh.
And that's sort of his office. And so what we need you to do is to go over to the bar, deal with him, and then take everything from the bar and put it into action in the studio and in the newsroom. So I wound up spending the next several years in bars.
Wow.
With Australian journalists and Peter Brennan in 1990, Peter left Current Affair to go to Hollywood, to go to the Paramount lot to take over a show called Hard Copy.
Yeah.
And I went with Peter and took over Hard Copy. And that's how I wound up in Hollywood, literally on the Paramount lot, where all the Jerry Lewis movies were made. And
Yes.
where Star Trek was being made at the time there, a revival of Star Trek. So
Sunset Boulevard.
We were right there. It was just like once upon a time in Hollywood.
And so that was a pretty quick introduction into the real world of Hollywood, into the big world.
Yes.
And
the politics of Hollywood, because we were working under really studio rules, was very different than working for a news organization.
Sure.
Hard Copy was a news magazine show, but really it was an entertainment show, and it was considered entertainment. And we were working under a whole different set of rules and politics out in Hollywood. It was really a baptism by fire.
I bet it was, and it certainly has got to be I know for a fact it had to have been a very different world and almost a culture shock to go from the mean streets of New York onto a studio lot like that, which is a lot more pleasant place to be.
Yes, we couldn't believe things like showing up in the morning and they had food laid out for everyone. It's like, what? You're spending money on food and you're paying for people's coffee? What is this? What's this in New York?
Yeah, in New York.
You're trying to find a place to live. It's like, this house is too big. I can't live in a place this big. I just need a room and a kitchenette in New York.
All right. So at what point did you transition over toward more of the entertainment side?
Well, beginning with Hard Copy, we started doing a lot more entertainment-type shows. We would, for instance, looking to separate ourselves from the other news and tabloid shows, we would do shows like The Last Days of Elvis Presley and bring actors in and reenact them almost as mini-movies.
Right.
We would take actual news stories. Like there was a woman named Betty Broderick who became famous because she was married to a doctor, and she basically supported him through medical school, supported him through the early years of his practice, and then when he got into middle age, he left her for his nurse, or his assistant, and Betty Broderick went in there and shot them both up and killed them, went on trial, and wound up being the subject of, I think, 3 television movies starring Meredith Baxter Birney.
Was this Dr. Herman Tarnauer?
No, that's back to the old Current Affair days. that was a Scarsdale diet doctor.
Oh yes. What was the name of this doctor?
Well, it was Dr. Broderick. It was Betty.
Oh,
everyone knew.
I see.
And we originally did a half hour. I believe we did several shows on it, and we called it A Woman Scorned. And we did it sort of as a drama. We reenacted it and had actors playing them. And then later the TV movie came out, and it was called Betty Broderick, A Woman Scorned. And so we found a lot of that. The way we were presenting the stories were being picked up by Hollywood. There were 3 Amy Fisher, Long Island Lolita movies.
Yes.
There was the Texas Cheerleader Mom movie, things like that. They were taking the templates from our shows. We left Hard Copy after 3 seasons in about 1993. Peter and I had another show called Premier's Story, which coincided with the O.J. Simpson murders. Then from there, I moved on to other type shows, documentaries, the clip shows, the clip show boom in the early 2000s, which was taking pieces of videos of car crashes and people hitting themselves in the crotch with baseball bats, those sort of shows.
Yeah.
Wrote a lot of those kind of things.
I find it fascinating, and have for some time, because I not only have been a writer for a very long time, but I've also been teaching it for a while now here in Pittsburgh. And what I find fascinating is the use of the word story, is that we we tell stories in news and we tell stories in fiction. And they're both stories, and they both follow a similar form so that the listener, the reader, the whoever is able to understand how we're communicating that tale. So you understood storytelling quite well.
Yes, and I think we sort of, not trying to brag or anything, but we sort of pioneered a bit the long-form storytelling on television and on television news.
Mm-hmm.
We're used to that 5-second soundbite, the 10-second soundbite, and telling a story in 90 seconds, or if a story, if you're doing local news, and even if you're doing these entertainment shows that are on TV now, a long story is 2 minutes.
Right.
We would do stories over the course of a week. We got a lot of resistance from it, but it rated, and people watched these shows, and we were able to tell stories differently. Well, I've always been far more attracted to real life stories, nonfiction, in a narrative form.
Right.
That's sort of what we did with
but once you correct me if you think I'm wrong, but once you take a story, even a nonfiction story, a biography, or however you want to put it, and you form it into a script and hire actors to do it, it ceases to be a real story. It becomes some kind of a fictionalized version of reality.
Well, the way that Peter Brennan used to explain it, because he came from newspapers, and that's how these guys sort of reinvented television. These Australians that worked for Rupert Murdoch, they weren't his television people; they were his newspaper editors and his magazine reporters. And Brennan would say, if you're telling a story in a newspaper, or you're writing a story, you're writing a story. You're telling it. You're forming it. You're giving people, an image in their minds. Well, here, if you do it correctly on television, how do you translate that to television if you don't have the actual images? Well, you do it through not necessarily the reenactments where you're showing people's faces or whatever, but you might see a hand on a gun, hand. You're basically illustrating a story that you've written.
Right. Right.
So of course, yes, it does take you away from the brutal reality of something, but it's just a way of illustrating a story that other people would say, "Oh, we can't put this on television because there's no picture here."
But you're still, I truly believe you're still creating for the reader or the viewer a character or characters in some kind of a tale with a beginning, middle, and end. And that it's following a who, what, where, when, why, how, just like a journalist would to a large extent. And so you are telling a story, and that's how they relate. That's why I think the transition, I'm going to guess, for you to go from pure journalism over to slightly less journalistic and more storytelling, all the way over to full storytelling, wasn't probably that difficult to do.
No, it wasn't. It was really a natural progression.
Yeah.
And a lot of it came from frustration that I had when I was working just for straight local television news. I was frustrated that stories weren't able to be told more fully, more colorfully, and the fact that when you work for network news, television news, you find that everybody wants to make sure they get the same story.
Yeah.
When you're sitting with your news director and you're watching that night's broadcast, you've got 3 screens in front of you and you're seeing what the competition got. It's like, well, why didn't we have exactly what they had? The difference was once we went over to the tabloid world, the idea was to get a story that no one else had, and not do the same story everybody had, and to tell it in a very different way.
And in some ways, it's got to be filled with conflict in order to drive the audience to you, correct?
Oh, sure. Conflict, emotion, the quote, bells and whistles. That was also why the genre got a lot of criticism. It had a lot to do with the promotion, and the stories were promoted like tabloid newspapers. You take the wildest elements of it and sensationalize it. The stories themselves were told pretty well, I think, when we did them at least. It was the promotions of the stories that made people say, "Oh, look how sensationalistic all this is."
It always has to appear in some way on a show like that, somewhat salacious. Yeah.
Right. You got to you're a carnival barker bringing people into the tent.
Right.
That's your tent. Yeah.
Well, and you're not focusing on stories of people petting their cats. It's violence, it's death, it's mayhem, it's whatever. That's not, something that's a little bit unpleasant.
Well, I'll tell you, back then. This is 1989, 1990, right around the turn of the 90s. There, things were changing technologically. You had microwave trucks, and you were able to get images from small towns when in the past you weren't able to. You could just shoot and satellite your material back overnight or during the day. In the 80s and 90s, network television had this idea of a thing called flyover country.
Yeah.
And that was basically America. They would cover Washington, the East Coast. Occasionally they go out to to Hollywood if there was an earthquake or an award ceremony or a famous actor died, but they really didn't cover the center of the country. You had guys like Charles Kuralt, who would drive around and do a story of somebody who constructed a Liberty Bell out of butter, or do a story of a guy who did wind chimes. What we did at A Current Affair, and this was before the days of the internet, every day we would have small-town papers delivered to our office, and I would go through a couple of hundred newspapers a day.
Wow.
Just going through it, looking at the headlines, and start seeing, wow, look at this. Here's a story of a preacher who burned down the church and ran away with the organist with all the money. Look at this story here. Here's a wife who shot her husband. And we started seeing patterns around the country. And we basically had these stories totally to ourselves. No one was covering them. And that's why we were taking these small-town stories. For instance, there was a funny story about a sheriff. His name was actually Sheriff Corky. And the sheriff had rented a video cassette recorder, video cassette player. And he brought it back to the store where he had rented it, but he had left the tape in. And, of course, he had recorded himself and his wife or his girlfriend doing some sort of hanky-panky. And one of his political rivals got a hold of the tape, made copies of it, and put it on everybody's car windshields the next day.
Lovely.
And so we were finding these patterns that were going on in America, this sort of underbelly of culture that was accepted but not talked about. And that's what A Current Affair and Hard Copy and shows like that did. It sort of gave a vision to the rest of the country that wasn't being covered by the networks.
It was
everything changed with the O.J. Simpson murders. That's where suddenly all the networks were covering the story that they at first wouldn't even touch.
Right.
That wasn't something they would do.
You were pre-internet.
Yeah.
So you were telling stories that would create their own sort of tornado force, news tornado, and you had to stoke that fire in other ways. That's why it was the advertising for it was so prurient, I guess.
Yeah, and then the advertising dollars weren't as much because there were campaigns against the shows. This is around the time I think they were doing campaigns against explicit words on record albums. There were certain groups that were going against shows like us and classifying us in the same terms of like the Jerry Springer, Morton Downey, quote, trash TV shows that were out there. It was interesting. But I'll tell you, the one thing that it did, I was talking about this undercurrent in America and this accepted subculture or underground morality. You go back to Charles Kuralt. And Charles Kuralt, again, was the man who was bringing America to network news. Today I'm in Idaho, and here's a man who's made a statue of Paul Bunyan. Well, after his death, it was found out that Charles Kuralt had a secret family out in Idaho. He had a secret wife. He had a secret daughter who he was putting through college. And that was the alternative morality that was out there in America that we were bringing out at the time. And if only Charles Kuralt had told the truth about what was going on in America, and it wasn't all Liberty Bells made out of butter, maybe there wouldn't have been a need for tabloid television in the first place.
That's true. That's true. It's always amazing what secrets come bubbling up, sometimes when people are alive, but frequently when they're gone.
Yeah.
All right, so, and then we'll get on to the book here in a moment, but all right, so then how did you wind up going from all of that into working on fictional shows?
Well, I started a production company. I had a partner by the name of Brett Hudson. Brett was
of the Hudson Brothers.
Called the Hudson Brothers.
Yeah, the Hudson Brothers, sure.
You remember them? Yeah, the Hudson Brothers. Back in the 70s, they were a rock and roll band who became television comedy stars.
Yeah.
Brett and I met when we were both hired to be producers of Miramax Television's first reality show. It was called The Best Money Can Buy. It was going to be a magazine show where you could find the best there is of everything. And this was working for Harvey Weinstein back in around 2000.
Speaking of salacious and rumors.
Well, the funny part about it was we were in L.A. Harvey Weinstein was in New York, and we had finished an edit of the show, and all we had to do was get the tape to Harvey, and Harvey had to approve the tape, and he had to He had to say it was okay, and then we could move on to the next step. Well, Harvey at the time was, I don't want to say buying, but he was buying the Oscar for Shakespeare in Love, which was the best picture that year.
Right.
And every time our office would call Harvey, they'd say, "Oh, he's out in his limousine," and he would be in a limousine with models. We would hear, and he kept sending us models to interview to become host of this show. And it went on for about 4 months. We couldn't get any kind of approval from Harvey Weinstein because he was too busy riding around in his limousine. We never heard anything criminal about Harvey Weinstein, but he had the reputation of being a man about town.
Yeah.
Brett and I went from there. We started our own company. We did documentaries. We did documentaries for Court TV, for Bravo. We did a documentary series on the White House screening room, the White House Theater. And with Brett, we did our first film. We wrote and produced Cloud 9 with Burt Reynolds.
Right.
Brett's old friend Al Ruddy, the producer of The Godfather.
Yeah.
And $1 Million Baby.
And $1 Million Baby, correct.
Clint Eastwood, yeah.
Al Ruddy's done lots of stuff.
Al Ruddy is really the a Mount Rushmore figure in Hollywood. Tremendous guy. We met Al. He was sort of at the time in the autumn of his career, not really doing too much, and we would have lunch with Al every day. Brett and I had a company that partnered with Al's company to do a series for Showtime, and we would sit and talk at this Chinese restaurant in Beverly Hills every afternoon. And one day Al said, I was back in New York and I was visiting my son on campus, and he had a picture of this woman on his wall, and it was Gabrielle Reese, the beach volleyball player.
Right.
And I said, I didn't know you were into beach volleyball. And he said, no. My son said, no, I'm not. I'm into Gabrielle Reese. I think she's really hot. And we said, well, wouldn't that be funny? We should do a movie about beach volleyball. How about a team made up of strippers? That's where our minds went immediately. And we thought it was very funny. And we wound up writing the script. And Al, of course, had produced the movie Cannonball Run, the movies with Burt Reynolds.
Right.
And also The Longest Yard with Burt Reynolds. And so we kind of wrote the story for Burt Reynolds and wound up actually getting the funding and making the picture.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It was so that was your introduction into the fictional part of Hollywood, yeah?
Yeah, that really was. That was the introduction into motion pictures, yeah.
All right, so along the way, you've worked on this, that, and the other thing, but I kind of want to bring us up to where you are now, which is you've written this book with Jeff Abraham called The Show Won't Go On.
Yeah.
What was the impetus to write this? First of all, tell the audience, our listeners, a little bit about what the book focuses on.
The Show Won't Go On is probably the first book to focus on the phenomenon of performers who died on stage during a performance.
Yeah.
I had written a book called Tabloid Baby, which was sort of my tabloid television memoirs and expose back in 1999. Jeff Abraham, who's a very well-known publicist here and very big, actually in the comedy world, he represents a lot of comedians and everybody. He represented the George Carlin estate after Carlin's death, and actually represented Carlin for the last decade of his life. Jeff represented my book back in 2000, and we worked together, became friends, bonded over our love of the Beatles and Jerry Lewis, and so we remained friends over the last 20 years. Well, about 3 years ago, Jeff was over, we were speaking, and he said, I always wanted to write a book about performers who died on stage, died on the way home from a show, died on the way to a show. I mean, you have people like Hank Williams who died on the way to a show. Harry Chapin died on the way to a show. Patsy Cline was killed on the way home from a show.
Yeah.
I said, that's a pretty fun idea. I've got a little time in my schedule. Let's do it. And he's like, well, okay. So we started doing the research, and we got to over 1,000 cases.
Oh, wow.
When we realized, we should narrow this down. Let's narrow this down to we have enough where we can do performers who died on stage. And by a stage, we're talking a theater, a nightclub, a circus tent,
performing.
An arena.
Performing.
We got that down to about 500 cases. we wrote the book. We threw everything in for our first draft of the book. We did the research.
500 cases?
We had 500 cases.
Oh, my goodness.
So we had to narrow that down after getting the book out, dealing with an agent, dealing with some publishers. We realized, okay, first of all, we originally had people who died in front of the movie camera or television cameras on television sets. So we got rid of all of them. We said, we'll save that for another book. We didn't include athletes or bullfighters or people that would go into an arena or a ring knowing that death is in the cards. These were performers.
Right.
So we had that down to about 500 cases. We narrowed it down to the top 99 that we felt were the most shocking, bizarre, and historic. When we finally got the book sold to the Chicago Review Press, they said, "Can you get it down to about 50?" I was like, "Well, not really." So we wound up with about 60 stories, and then we reference others. And in the end, the book has about 200 cases are listed in the book of performers who died on stage. Our other problem with it, man, is that people kept dying on stage. Every time we think we were done with the book, we'd find out that on our website, we have a website, theshowwon'tgoon.com, where we have a page where we're just keeping track of performers who've passed on performing in 2019, and we've got about 25.
Wow, really?
We managed to get one extra person in. There was a comedian in the UK named Ian Cognito. He was performing at a comedy club, I believe in about February of this year, and he said to the audience, imagine if I had a stroke and I woke up speaking Welsh. Got a big laugh. Then he sat down on a chair on the stage and died.
Oh, my goodness.
And everyone thought that this was part of the show, and it wasn't. And that made international news, and that's why we spoke to the publisher and we said we've got to add this story in. So we managed to get that one last story in. I've
read through the book, and of course, sort of in line with that, with what you just said about Ian Cognito, which is a hilarious name. I really have long known about the story of Dick Shawn, who a lot of today's viewers would not know who Dick Shawn was. But can you tell a little bit about the Dick Shawn story and who he was?
Well, first, really we have to get back to, again, who was Dick Shawn. Dick Shawn was really one of the most influential, innovative comedians of his time. He came up in the late 50s along with people like Lenny Bruce and Jonathan Winters and Dick Gregory. He wound up being a great influence on comedians like Andy Kaufman, Robin Williams, and Gary Shandling.
Mm-hmm.
But most people know him from the movie The Producers, the original one with that Mel Brooks did with Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder. Dick Shawn played LSD, the hippie who they hired to portray Adolf Hitler in Springtime for Hitler. And he had a wild part in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World.
Yes.
That's kind of where people know Dick Shawn. Although he had a big television career, he was a Broadway leading man. He was a singer, he was a dancer. But first off, he was a comedian. And he had a show called The Second Greatest Entertainer in the Whole Wide World. And that was his one-man show. And towards the end of his life, he performed that everywhere. In 1987, he was planning to bring it to the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. So he had some new material to try out. And on April 17th, he went down to San Diego, to the University of San Diego auditorium there, to try out some material. And he was doing his act, and it was the usual surrealistic, wild stuff that he did, with a catch. I should mention this. Dick Shawn would open the act by lying down on stage covered in newspapers. So when the audience walked into the theater, they didn't realize he was on the stage. He was perfectly, muscle and breathing control. He didn't move. Then when the audience was all seated, it was time for the show to begin, the lights would come down, and Dick Shawn would arise up from the newspapers. And when it came time for intermission, Dick Shawn would say, I'm going to take a nap right now. Or he would just fall down and lie down, sleeping or comatose throughout intermission, and then rise again for the second half of the show. So all the stagehands were warned, look, if this guy happens to fall down, stay away from his part of the act. Okay, so he gets about 20 minutes into his show, and he says, let's imagine there was a nuclear war outside, and no one survived in the world except the people in this theater, and I would be your leader. And with that, he face planted onto the stage and just lay there. And there was laughter, and then as he remained not moving, there was uncomfortable laughter, people saying, hey, take his wallet, and things like that. Sadly, his son, Dick Shawn's son, Adam, was his stage manager and stage director, and he was at the back of the theater. And he realized that, my dad doesn't usually fall like that and doesn't hit his head like that when he falls. That was pretty hard. He got on the headset, and he said to the stagehand, go on and check on him. Could you please just check on him? So the stagehand walked out to laughter, and then walked out again, and Adam said, well, what happened? What did he say? He goes, well, he didn't say anything. He wasn't really moving. And at that point, Adam Shawn realized something had happened, and he rushed toward the stage. The theater happened to be next door to a teaching hospital, so there were already, you didn't have to say, is there a doctor in the house? There were 4 doctors in the front row. Everybody went to work on Dick Shawn, but he did not survive.
Well, he was long gone at that point.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the stranger stories, because it seems so much a part of the act that people didn't know what to do with it.
Well, that's the thing. The worst job you can have when you die on stage is to be a comedian, because when you fall, people think it's part of the act.
Sure.
And when someone says, is there a doctor in the house? Well, you're going to get a laugh from that. And that's happened numerous times.
Mm-hmm.
That line, is there a doctor in the house? Just slays.
Literally.
Yeah.
So, all right. So how did you put this together? Where did you find these different people? What was your research like?
Well, the research was the deep dive. We start with the internet. Then from there we go to newspaper files. Variety has volumes of old stories. Microfilm at libraries. Jeff and I went in a couple of different directions. Both of us are experienced at research. Jeff's a comedy historian. Jeff has the largest collection of comedy albums, I think, in the world.
Really?
And whenever there are documentaries or films done, they go to Jeff, to get the resource of comedy albums.
Interesting.
So we both know how to do research. And so, one thing you find out is that, Wikipedia, believe it or not, it's got a lot of misinformation on it. And one thing we found is that we were able to correct a lot of misconceptions that have been out there for decades, just because stories float around that aren't true.
Like what?
We went to the source.
Like, give us an example.
Well, people think that Dick Shawn died, in a comedy club, for instance, that sort of thing. People think that certain people died on stage. Oh, you got to do Granny Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies.
Irene Ryan
on Broadway.
Irene Ryan, she was in Pippin.
Ryan. Right. And it's like, well, no, she didn't die on stage. She had a stroke on stage, and then went back to California, and she didn't die for about another 4 months. But so she doesn't count.
She doesn't count.
The main one, the biggest story, was the story of J.I. Rodale. Mr. Rodale was a longevity expert, a natural foods expert, a health nut, who was a guest on the Dick Cavett show.
Yeah.
When he died while being interviewed on the Dick Cavett show. This is something that everyone remembers. They all remember the show where the guy said on the Dick Cavett show, "I'm going to live to be 100," and then died on the Dick Cavett show. We spoke to Dick Cavett, and he says, maybe 3 or 4 people come up from every month and say, "Dick, I'll never forget the look on your face when that guy died on your show." And Dick says, "Really? Were you in the studio audience? Because the show never aired." They're like, "What?" And people think the show aired because he told the story the next day. Pete Hamill, the newspaper editor and writer, was actually being interviewed by Cavett at the time that Mr. Rodale collapsed in the seat next to him, and he wrote about it. So people think that they've seen it. It's become sort of ingrained as the most famous talk show death. Thanks to a good friend of ours who happens to work with the Cavett organization, he allowed us to view and record the audio of the show. Jeff and I were probably the first civilians to actually watch it and see what happened. So we were able to correct a lot of factoids that have been out there for years. For instance, it said that it's sort of famous that when Cavett was interviewing Pete Hamill, Mr. Rodale made a snoring sound, and that Cavett leaned over and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Rodale, are we boring you?" That never happened. He never said that.
Huh.
Little things like that. You know, when it happened, Cavett and Cavett and Pete Hamill both knew immediately something was wrong, and there was a look of shock and alarm on both their faces. Interestingly enough, Cavett told us when he realized that Rodale was in the process of dying on his stage, he looked at the audience and he was about to say, "Is there a doctor in the house?" But he stopped himself because he knew that if he said that, he'd get a laugh.
Wow.
So he didn't say that. He said something like,
right.
"There's
So,
someone who can help."
So when you're doing this deep dive, did you travel to do all that? Did you go find various libraries, or was it mostly done from California?
It was mostly done from California. We did a lot of interviews with people, with survivors and witnesses, and that was very interesting. For instance, we met with Dick Shawn's son, Adam, and that also gave us a real, sense of how serious this book was, because we had some agents, publishers say, "Well, you got to make it funny and snarky, and you've got to make it, you got to make people laugh with this stuff." Now, of course, there's some stuff that's humorous and ironic. The woman who sang "Please Don't Talk About Me When I'm Gone" and then died to a standing ovation. There's irony in all of this. But when you talk to a survivor, you talk to someone, and in the case of Adam Shawn, his father died in 1987, and he's crying during the interview. You realize, these are real people here, and they also, almost to a person, they were very happy to speak with us because they wanted their loved one, their relative, their friend, to be remembered for more than the way they passed.
Of course.
And that's what we made sure that we did in this book, is we tell the story of their careers. Some of them are very famous, some are obscure, and they all sort of, stand or lie shoulder to shoulder here, through this sort of glorious exit, dying doing what they loved, as they say.
Well, I'm a big fan of gallows humor because I just think that the alternative is not fun, and I would rather remember someone fondly or in a light way rather than in a really dark, heavy way. Of course, there are many exceptions to that, but I'm a fan of gallows humor. So I think it's good sometimes when you have this so that you can get that perspective on it. Tell the story about Harry Einstein, which I think is fascinating.
Well, Harry Einstein was a dialect comic back in the 1930s.
Explain what a dialect comic is.
I was just going to tell you.
Oh.
He took on the character. He was Jewish, Harry Einstein. He took on the character of Park Your Carcass.
Park Your Carcass.
A Greek diner owner at first. Later, I think Park Your Carcass had a radio show where he was a politician. But Park Your Carcass was his character. And he was very well known on the radio. He was in a couple of films. He was a member of the Friars Club. By 1958, he wasn't in great shape. He had some heart issues. He basically did his work at Friars Roasts and Friars Benefits. By the way, Harry Einstein happened to be the father of Albert Brooks and Bob Einstein.
Albert Einstein.
That's how you can tell his dad was a comedian. Now you know why Albert Brooks changed his name to
Albert Brooks, yeah.
So he was the father of Albert Brooks and Super Dave, Bob Einstein, who passed last year.
Yeah.
There was a Friars Club testimonial dinner for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills. And they had the dais, and everyone was up there from Milton Berle to Sammy Davis Jr. Art Linkletter was the host. And Park Your Carcass came out and made one of his rare appearances. And there's audio of this. We have it on our website, where you can hear him do his act. And it was a lot of one-liners and funny things. And the audience went crazy. I mean, he, no pun intended, killed. and you could hear people hitting the table and banging on the tables with laughter, etc. He did his act and went back to sit down to seat at the dais. And Art Linkletter said, why doesn't this guy have his own television show? He is so funny. And Harry Einstein said, yeah, why not? And with that, he collapsed into Milton Berle's lap.
Ugh.
And then at that point, all pandemonium broke loose. They said, is there a doctor in the house? And there happened to be about 100 doctors in the house because it was Beverly Hills, it was the Friars Club, and it was a benefit for a leper colony. So a lot of doctors ran up toward the dais. Milton Berle, at this point, screamed over to a young singer named Tony Martin and said, do something. Just try to sing a song. So Tony Martin went up, they struck up the band, and he sang a song called There's No Tomorrow. Again, this is that you can't make this kind of stuff up department.
And by the way, Milton Berle's lap has its own reputation.
Well, exactly. He fell there and met his nephew. It was very interesting. They brought Harry Einstein backstage. They carried him out. George Burns and others, and Jack Benny, all carried him backstage, where 5 doctors went to work on him.
Oh my goodness!
And they did sort of a MacGyver thing. They tore a lamp cord out of the wall, cut through the wires, cut open his chest with a penknife, took his heart out, and tried to shock it back with the electricity from the
really?
From the wall. It was an amazing sort of story there. In the end, they were unable to save him.
Well, yeah, they took his heart out of his chest in a kitchen.
Yeah, that was it.
Holy moly! All right, so what are those stories among your favorites, or do you have any others that are your favorite stories?
I have some of my favorite stories are ones that are a little less known. The story that we start off with is the story of a woman named Jane Little. Jane was 87 years old. She played the double bass for the Atlanta Symphony. She was 4'11". The bass was about 7 feet tall.
Right.
She had recently won the Guinness World Record for the longest tenure with a symphony orchestra. She actually had stayed on for an extra season, although she had been ill, to get that world record. She was a feisty little gal, and everybody loved her. And it was the last concert of the season. It was a Pops concert on a Sunday afternoon, and they were in the final bars of the encore when she fell over dead.
Ooh.
And the name of the song that they were performing was There's No Business Like Show Business. And that was one of those stories where, we spoke to people who were in the orchestra, all youngsters, guys in their 60s or their 50s and younger, and they would say, you know what, it really was a great way for Jane to go. She didn't go in a nursing home or in a hospital, on a ventilator. She was surrounded by people who loved her, surrounded by her friends, with an audience. What a way to go, which I guess you can say when you're 87 years old.
Well, I think it's my belief that anyone who, first of all, let me back up. We're all going there at some point. Nobody's ever escaped it that I'm aware of, and if you can do it in a time and place that you love, that you're comfortable with, and that you love, I would say that that's as good as it gets. Wouldn't you?
I would think so. That's a way to go. We've spoken to performers. We talked to Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller.
Yeah.
In the book, and he said he looks at it statistically about the amount of time that he spends on stage when he's awake, and he thinks there's a good chance he will die on stage. He would like to go that way if he can. Yeah,
that's where he's lived his whole life, so he loves it there.
Yeah, I think if you get if you're young and something, we've had young people who died in accidents on stage, etc. Those are tragic. But when you get the people that are old, and we've found that a lot of old school entertainers that we looked up or that we talked to really do. They have said that. That's the way I want to go. I want to go on stage.
Sure, and yeah, that makes sense. All right, so how many drafts of the book did you go through? How long did it take you to actually pull this whole thing together?
Jeff and I worked on this for about 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah, we did. We worked about 3 years on this. Yeah, from the research, we began the writing. I'm trying to think. That began the writing around the beginning of 2017, and yeah.
And,
So we spent about 2 years writing it.
and then, of course, you had to go through the whole publishing process, which is a whole process unto itself.
Yeah.
What would you say were the biggest, or maybe perhaps the single big challenge in conceiving and writing the book? What were the big challenges?
The big challenge was, first of all, making sure that we had everything right. The research and the fact checking, which the publishers were very good at helping us with. That was a big part of it, and then also figuring out which stories to include and which ones not to include.
Sure.
We did an appendix where we just threw in 50 more in the appendix.
Did you have a criterion as to how
opened up into a bigger story?
Sure. Did you have criterion as to what was included and not?
Okay, you basically had to be stricken or collapse on stage.
Goodness.
And we'll give you a 10-hour window to pass on. All right, because again, people collapse on stage and die 6 months later. The two, we do have two exceptions because they were both so striking. One of them is Jackie Wilson, the great singer.
Yes.
Jackie Wilson, who collapsed on stage during a Dick Clark rock and roll revival at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He was singing the song "Lonely Teardrops," his hit.
Right.
And there comes the line where he says, "My heart is crying, crying," and he said, my heart," and grabbed his chest and fell backwards with a heart attack, slammed his head on the stage and had a stroke. He remained in a coma, or a semi-coma, for the next 8 years before he died. We included his story, and we also included the story of Curtis Mayfield,
Superfly,
and from the Impressions.
Sure.
He was on stage at an outdoor concert in Queens, New York, in 1990, when a gust of wind came down and blew down all the speakers and rigging on top of him, paralyzed him from the neck down, and it took him 9 years to die. But for the most part, everyone else, you basically had to be stricken on stage and die. It
was a 10-hour window.
We kind of gave it that. Some might maybe have hung on for a bit. We found a lot of times people, die on stage. They don't pronounce them dead until they're at the hospital, et cetera, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And also the stories. We had to make sure it couldn't just be a book where it's like, okay, he died, she died. We had to have people who had very diverse stories, and we've got the story of the man who was the world's expert on African violets out of Nebraska, and he traveled the world lecturing about African violets and he wrote a book, and he had a flower shop in Nebraska, but his dream was to be an actor because he caught the community theater bug. When he turned 64, he and his wife closed the flower shop and moved to Las Vegas to be near their son and his daughter, his son and his wife, who was pregnant and was about to have a child. And he got to Las Vegas and got a job as a star of a show in community theater. And he went on stage and had a heart attack on stage and died. The name of the show was The Art of Murder. When he died, he had a prop pistol in his pocket, and the police at the emergency room were used to actual shooting deaths there. Actually, called his wife and said, "Should we do an investigation of this?" He had a gun, and I said, "No, it was a prop. Don't worry about it." And then he died in the hospital, and then 12 hours later, his grandchild was born in the same hospital.
Oh, wow. So
we spoke to his son, and he said, you talk about the circle of life. There you go.
That is. I was for a second there. I thought you were going to tell me when he collapsed on stage and fell, the gun fired. that would be.
No, we have had some shooting deaths on stage. Yeah.
Like who?
Well, the one that's, I guess, people know the most if you're into rock and roll is Dimebag Darrell Abbott. He was in the band called Pantera.
Yeah.
He was in a nightclub, I think it was about 2008. Let me see if I have his. It was 2004. He was in Columbus, Ohio, on stage when a deranged ex-Marine ran out from behind the speakers, shot him in the face, killed him on stage during his opening song, killed 3 other people. And that was a story where a policeman showed up within the first minute and a half of this happening, walked into the club where the gunman had the drum technician in a headlock with a gun to his head, holding him hostage as if it was in some kind of movie scene. And from across the room, the cop shot with a shotgun and killed the gunman.
Oof.
A little different
than just collapsing. Yeah, that's quite different.
There's all sorts of excitement at these shows.
So, all right. Well, so we are rapidly coming toward the end of today's episode, and we've been speaking for almost an hour with Burt Kearns mainly about The Show Won't Go On, his new book with Jeff Abraham, and it had some fantastic stories from this book. I think anybody that's interested in show business and how it doesn't always turn out well should check this book out for sure. So I'm wondering, Burt, in all of your experiences, and not just in researching the book and so on, do you have a story or two that you can tell us that would be perhaps oddball, quirky, weird, offbeat, or just plain funny?
Well, I think everything I've done has been oddball and quirky.
Well, good. Tell us something.
I can think of a couple. When I was working at NBC News, local news, at one point I was writing the personality bits, the little celebrity stories that go at the end of the show. And I would practice my writing. I would practice by saying, okay, I'm going to write this story. It'll have it take up 20 seconds. All right, now let me rewrite it and see if I can get it down to 10 seconds. I bet I can write this story and get it down to 5 seconds, and really honing my writing that way. Well, anyway, I wrote a story once, and it was just a typical one where I wrote about the late Abe Vigoda. And so I'm sitting there at work, and the next day, as it turned out, one of my colleagues went into the NBC commissary, and standing there holding a tray was Abe Vigoda,
right?
Who didn't happen to be dead.
So for our younger listeners, explain who Abe Vigoda was.
Abe Vigoda was the actor who played, I believe he played Tessio in The Godfather, but he's known as Fish from Barney Miller.
Right.
He was a hangdog, old actor who everybody always thought was dead.
He looked old in his 20s.
And it became a joke later in life where he would come out and people would refer to him as, the late Abe Vigoda. I was one of the first to do it on television. And the next day, I got a tap on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Abe Vigoda. And he said, "I'm not dead." And you've never seen someone apologize and be so quick to write a correction. But corrections that's also a bane in television. When I was working for CBS Night Watch, I worked for them. I worked for the CBS Morning News while I was at Night Watch. I worked there for one day, and I got there, and it was Bill Curtis was the host. Bill Curtis was the anchorman. He was in Washington that day, and his co-host was Diane Sawyer.
Right.
And Diane Sawyer was there, and I got to write for Diane Sawyer. And it was great. You write these little news items for them, and then you sit back, you sit up all night writing the stories, and you sit and watch the show. And I watched as she read the story, and she said, today, General Motors is recalling 4 cars. And she did the story. And I see the editor jump up in the air and realize that in all the times I had rewritten the story, I left out the word million, that they had recalled 4 million cars, but she just reading the teleprompter wrote 4 cars. And then I had to write the correction, and then was never invited back to CBS Morning News.
They're just 4 cars. They recalled all those cars over 4 cars.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been as bad or newsworthy.
Do you have any more?
Well, there's a few. One of my greatest diversions was with Jerry Lewis.
Yeah.
When I was at Channel 4 News at NBC News in New York in the late '80s, I had a friend who worked upstairs at Saturday Night Live. She was the assistant director, and in 1987 she had a job as the assistant director on the Jerry Lewis Telethon in Las Vegas. And I happened to be a great Jerry Lewis fan. I was then, and I said, "Can you please get me a job as a production assistant? I'll do anything if I could just spend. I want to stay up all night, all weekend with Jerry. Can you get me a gig?" And she's like, "All right, sure." So she wound up getting me a job as a volunteer production assistant on the 1987 Jerry Lewis Telethon from Las Vegas. I arrived at Caesar's Palace and went to the trailer outside, and they said, "Who are you?" I said, "Well, I'm a production assistant." They said, "Great, get over here. Jerry was just here. You've got to make a fix for us. This is important. This is coming right from Jerry." And I was in heaven. I'm like, "Oh, this is unbelievable." I sit down. This was the days, of course. It was a typewriter, and they plopped down in front of me the show rundown, a couple hundred pages. And it was a show that had all the camera instructions and who's who and what's going to be happening over the course of the telethon. And they handed me a bit of whiteout, a little bottle of whiteout, and a typewriter. And they said, "Jerry came in and he noticed this. You've got to make the correction at the top of every page." At the top of every page it said, "The 1987 Muscular Dystrophy Telethon." I had to white out the words muscular dystrophy and type in the words Jerry Lewis.
Oh, really?
Because Jerry wanted everyone to know that it was the Jerry Lewis telethon, and I was in heaven.
Wow. So did you get to meet Jerry?
I did. I got to meet Jerry. My main thing was I wanted to find out. At the end of every telethon, Jerry Lewis sings the song "You'll Never Walk Alone."
Right.
He cries and then he drops the mic and walks off. And I wanted to see. I wanted to see if he was for real, if that was like an act, if Jerry Lewis was just this showbiz guy who put on the fake tears, and then once he walks out off stage, he's like, "Okay, well, that's it, I'm out of here." So I actually got to stand right at the edge of the stage, right off camera, when Jerry Lewis cried, dropped the mic, and walked off stage, and I got to see whether or not he was for real.
And? Was he?
He was for real.
He was for
real.
real.
Fell into his wife's arms and wept for about another couple of minutes straight.
Wow.
Thanks to that, 2 years later, I was the managing editor of A Current Affair, and I wrote Jerry Lewis a letter, and I said, I told him what happened. I said, I was there 2 years ago. I'm a great fan of yours. I collect copies of the album Jerry Lewis Just Sings, and I would love to take a camera crew and follow you around behind the scenes of the telethon this year, which no one had ever done. A week later, I got a phone call from Jerry Lewis. He said, "I read your letter. This is great. What do you want? The only thing I ask is that you don't turn this into like a 2-minute piece." I said, "Jerry, the whole show." This is great. And he said, my staff will do whatever you want. Come on down. And we wound up spending a week with Jerry Lewis, behind the scenes.
Well, that's cool.
In preparation of the telethon.
That's really cool. Was he nice to you, because he had a bit of a reputation?
Jerry Lewis has his reputation, but I Gilbert Gottfried says the same thing. He was always nice to me, and he was a prince. He was Jerry Lewis. He did everything on camera for us that you would want Jerry Lewis to do.
Sure, all the shtick.
He tap danced. He had a tantrum. He did his lady stuff. He joked around. He loved having the camera crew following him around. And then we sat down to do an interview, which was supposed to be about 5 minutes. We did an hour-long interview with him. And he was terrific. He was a prince. He was great.
Well, that's exciting. It's good to know, because he does have that rep as being, mercurial, and he's obviously clearly one of the great comic minds of all time, but he also had a reputation for being a little bit, angry at people every now and then.
Oh, yeah. He was. Jerry Lewis was crazy. I consider Jerry Lewis to be the epitome of 20th century entertainment, the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. He was somebody, first of all, he was famous from the time he was about 18, and he had a career that lasted like more than 70 years, and he did everything. He was a comedian, a writer, a singer, an orchestra conductor, a dancer, a director, a writer. He mastered so many.
You've left out producer.
And he was a producer, of course, yeah.
Yeah, he did it. He did it all. It's correct. He was multi-hyphenate and massively talented. Burt, do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you can lend to our viewers, who are our listeners, who are maybe just trying to find their way into the business somehow, or maybe they've been in a little bit and are trying to get to the next level?
All I can say is, what I have always done is I've always said, keep your mouth shut and listen and learn. And when you get into a gig, let's say at an entry-level position, learn everything you can from the people you're working with. I mean, one thing you find is, it's less in the news business. If you're in New York City, you're working in news, you've got to have some chops to begin with to get in there and do it. I find in the entertainment business, people come from all over the place. A lot of them don't have experience, but they get by on a mixture of, arrogance and incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the key is to be competent and to listen and to learn. I mean, back in the old days, I would say to my friends at work, I'd say, my secret, I say, is every day I iron my shirt. Go to work, iron your shirt, look good. You come to work now, people come to work in shorts and flip-flops and T-shirts, and they're spending more time worrying about who's going to play second base in the softball game after the show. But if you concentrate on the work when you're there, learn everything you can, and that's all I did from the beginning, was just, watch people, listen and learn.
I think that's extraordinarily important advice for anyone who's working almost in any career, but especially in show business, is to spend the requisite amount of time doing your due diligence by paying attention to those who have already done it, and to listen more than you talk. I think that's very valuable advice. Well, again,
as a writer, can I just say one other thing?
Sure.
As a writer, I have many friends who've started to write books, and they get 50 pages in, and they don't get past that.
Yeah.
It's not a matter. I found, especially to me, it's less a matter of talent than it is of just perseverance.
Perseverance.
And if you're writing a book, don't stop. If you write 1 page a day, in 3 months you'll have, however, I'm not good at math, 90 pages.
Right. Exactly.
You write but get to that once. If you're at that you get to 100 pages, you'll finish your book. But don't stop at 50. Because some people stop. I got 50 pages. And keep writing. That's my main thing. Is just just wear them out. Just keep doing it in any case.
Well, the only way to get to a finished draft is to write a first draft, which is invariably going to be poor, and you just need to keep writing.
Yeah, keep doing it.
Indeed. Well, I've been speaking for the last hour plus with Burt Kearns, and I just wanted to say that for a show that focused so much on dead people, it's been a very lively show.
Stay healthy.
I want to thank you so much for coming on, Burt, and
thanks for having me.
It's been a great chatting with you. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.